Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition. Every passing week, the national championship picture continues to take shape. Some injuries, some teams actually going out there and playing teams with pulses. It's amazing what we get on the college slate during the month of October. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my college football colleagues, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, hopefully you guys are ready for another litmus test Saturday of sorts, especially in the Big Ten.
Yeah, excited for this week's games here. We're going to find out a lot about some of these teams. I know we say this every week, but there are still a few teams out there in the country that really haven't played the strongest competition. One certainly going to be down in Columbus in Penn State that we haven't seen them play anybody with a pulse yet.
Let's start there, Todd. Lead us.
All right. I mean, hey, look, there's no reason for foreplay around these parts. We can dive right into the games themselves.
Brad gave you the perfect lead.
Yeah, look, I mean, you guys are the consummate pros around these parts, so you make my job that much easier. So we will kick things off with the big noon kickoff, a game on Fox between Penn State and Ohio State right out of the chute. Noon Eastern, 9 a.m. out here on the West Coast. And we've seen a little money come in on the favorite here on Wednesday morning. This number did get as low as a soft 3.5. We're out to pretty much 4.5 painted across the board. Total sits at 46.5, and these are two of the three remaining undefeated teams in the Big Ten. Michigan, of course, is the other. No other conference has 3+ undefeated teams. First meeting all time where both teams will come into this game with a record of 6-0 or better, and you look at what they've been able to do on the defensive side of the ball. Two of the best three scoring defenses in the entire FBS. Penn State allowing 8 points per game, Ohio State at 9.7. Both of them, of course, trailing the maize and blue. When we look at Penn State, it's been over a calendar year since the Nittany Lions failed to get bettors to the window with a cover. That game was against Michigan in the middle of October a year ago, and they're winning by an average of more than 36 points per game. They've won 11 straight contests by 14+ points, and last weekend's win over UMass was the largest shutout win for the program since 1991. Meanwhile, Ohio State, no stranger to margin of victory themselves, 26.3 in that regard, fifth in the FBS. They've won 39 of the last 41 home games. Their only losses, 2021 against number 12 Oregon and 2022 against number 3 Michigan. Ryan Day remains unblemished against teams not coached by Jim Harbaugh. You look at some of the defensive metrics and they don't lie in any of those capacities. So Payne, when we look at Penn State, this is a team that's gone out there. It's exceeded odds makers' expectations. They've answered the bell every time they've been tested. And I laugh when I say tested because I think Illinois probably the only game of sorts that you can use as a measuring stick, maybe West Virginia way back in week 1. And while the offense has scored 30 points in 13 straight games, they have a +10 turnover margin. We haven't seen the big play potential. The three of us broke down Penn State during the preseason, talked about some of their offensive line concerns, and those have manifested with two elite running backs, both averaging less than 5 yards per carry. This team is outside the top 100 in big play percentage on offense. Penn State's offense going to meet a test in Ohio State that they haven't seen anything like thus far.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when you have two top 5 defenses kind of duking it out to see which one is better, typically the path to winning is either explosiveness, because having sustained drives is extremely difficult against elite defenses, or turnovers. And when there isn't a massive talent gap, turnovers are almost impossible to project. When there isn't a massive talent gap, explosiveness isn't nearly as consistent in projections as the down-to-down success stuff. But I don't see a ton of down-to-down success in this game by either offense, and so there's a reason, right? This game got whacked down to 46.5 by dinner Monday and then was dummied back up to the key of 48 and whacked under again yesterday, and you're kind of sitting here in the market at probably a consensus 46. Now, I'm interested to hear how Brad feels about the other side in a minute or two, but a game like this, for me, it just seems like there's more of an interlocking, like a connectivity. But, just kind of looking at this side in a vacuum, just pure feel, I feel like Penn State should have asked more of Drew Allar the first 6 games of the season to better prepare him for a moment like this, right? Saturday in the shoe. Allar just hasn't been asked to do anything past beginner level. He's thrown 8 passes beyond 18 yards all season against a schedule of defenses outside the top 60 in efficiency. If you look at average depth of target, Allar is 145th out of 156 quarterbacks. And you mentioned the O-line being a little bit of an issue past probably one of the first tackles taken in this draft coming up. But the wide receiver group was another massive question. Went out and got Dante Cephas from Kent State. Kind of having trouble adjusting to the Power 5 level. Went out, got Malik McClain from FSU. Never really put it together at Florida State. At best was going to be the 4th outside receiver on the depth chart behind Keon, Johnny, and Kentron. Trey Wallace did return against UMass after missing the prior 3 games with an injury. More than half his catches have gone for 10-plus yards. Supposed to be Penn State's best downfield threat. James Franklin said in his presser he believes Wallace is a huge piece to the puzzle. We'll see, right? Right now, Penn State's outside the top 100 in explosive pass percentage, yards per pass, EPA per pass, and it's quietly, and you hit it, impacting the ground game. If you look at the down-to-down, Penn State's run game looks solid. It's top 30 in the country in schedule-adjusted rushing success rate. The problem is there's no burst. You look at Nicholas Singleton, has not been the home run threat he was last season. Yards per carry down 2.7 yards. The elusive grade down 65 points. Kentron Allen and Nick Singleton, if you look at them through 6 data points, they're averaging both less yards before first contact and less yards after first contact. Penn State's outside the top 100 in explosive rush rate because of that. So is Penn State really going to go into the shoe and upset Ohio State in a Jim Knowles defense with a phone booth offense? I don't know. Run blocking was the other question we had about Penn State's offense coming into the season. Right now, Penn State's top 40 in offensive line yards created, top 50 in run block grade. Sounds okay, but it's Penn State, and you've played a bunch of inferior opponents. The games Ohio State's lost or should have lost in the Ryan Day era is because of physicality. So, if Penn State can churn out 3.5, 4 yards a carry, you probably have a shot here staying within this number. But if Drew Allar has to do something he hasn't been asked to do against a pretty exotic Jim Knowles defense, could be trouble. But again, it kind of interested to hear Brad's thoughts because there's so much correlation here. If Ohio State's offense isn't actually doing anything, suddenly Drew Allar can continue being checked down Charlie, and it becomes the 3 yards in a cloud of dust run game that takes center stage for Penn State.
Before we jump into the Buckeyes offense, wanted to ask you a quick follow-up, Payne. When you look at Ohio State defensively, I know there was an interesting article in The Athletic that talked to opposing coaches about the Buckeyes and Penn State, and they said one of the things that stood out to them was that Ohio State didn't have some of the same athletes along the defensive line that you had to prepare for in the past. NFL caliber talent. What have you seen from the Buckeye stop unit that leads you to believe that you can be optimistic about what they can be going forward, or that gives you some reservations as they begin to step up in class?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a Chase Young out there, right? That seems pretty evident. They don't have an elite pass rusher, but they're pretty physical along the defensive line. And so, I think that ability to get out there and stop the run, to me, you're not really facing an elite Penn State offensive line. Sure, you have Fasciano at left tackle who's going to be elite, but to me, the middle of the defensive line for Ohio State is still very solid, and it just comes down to stopping the run this game. Like, you think Penn State and you're like, hey, elite. I don't see that from their offensive line outside of one guy.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And look, from a wide receiver standpoint, there aren't some of the names that we've grown accustomed to in the past. The KJ Hamlers of the world, the Jahan Dotsons that go out there and could put fear into Buckeyes defense that may or may not have one of their most talented corners back in the mix in Denzel Burke. So, Brad, when we begin to dig into the Buckeyes offensively, this is a team now that ranks 3rd in the Big Ten in scoring, 20th nationally, 1st in total offense, 1st in passing offense, and 9th in their ability to run the football in the conference, 92nd overall. It's not something we've grown accustomed accustomed to from the Scarlet and Gray. They've gone through a laundry list of injury concerns in the backfield. Travion Henderson missing 2 games. Mayan Williams missed Purdue. Chip Trainum wasn't able to finish, and it was Dallas Hayden that carried their lunch for them in that 41-7 win last week against West Lafayette. But we did see something a little bit different that I found interesting from the Buckeyes in the win against Purdue. When Ryan Day was asked about it, he says that we're trying to add layers to our offense each week, and that was motion that they put on display for the first time that we hadn't grown accustomed to in the past. We know the strength of this Penn State team is on the defensive side. They should have a little bit of an edge along that D-line and in the secondary if they can take away Marvin Harrison or neutralize his effectiveness. But where do you go when you begin to handicap what Kyle McCord and company can do on the offensive side against a very talented Penn State defense, though, that hasn't been tested yet this season?
Well, I think it starts with what pieces are going to be available and what pieces are going to be 100% healthy for this game. Because you mentioned, the injuries. That was kind of a little bit of a mash unit last week. That's why we saw a little bit of sharp groups late in the week come in on the Purdue side, even though the Buckeyes ended up winning and covering that one relatively easily. Henderson, Williams, Egbuka, a wide receiver, all out. You mentioned Trainum leaving early in the first quarter of that game. From what I've been reading so far, Ryan Day said he's hopeful to have all those guys back for this one. That'll be key. I will say this. I was kind of impressed on the fly what they did. You mentioned the motions that they utilized a little bit. They utilized a bunch of different things. They brought in Devin Brown in the goal line, was running him quite a bit. Receiver Xavier Johnson got some carries. You mentioned, obviously, Hayden, who had some experience taking over last year when the running back position was banged up. He had a good game against Maryland. I like that kid. He's out of Memphis, a young, good running back for him. But you certainly, in a game like this, you want a guy like Henderson, not only for the experience, but you saw what he did against Notre Dame. He had the one big explosive, was a pretty big play in that game in the second half of that one. So it'll be interesting to see who's available and how much they can utilize them. I will say this, as far as the offense goes, obviously you got an All-American wide receiver, the best wide receiver in the country in Harrison. It's all about how many times you can get him the football, how much Penn State's going to roll over their coverage to that side. Is he going to get some opportunities in this game? We saw a freshman last week really emerge in Carnell Tate, 5-star kid, impressed in the spring game. We'll see if he gets even more snaps if Buka's not 100% healthy this week. The guy that I've been probably most impressed with as far as relative to expectation on that offense this year, not McCord at quarterback, but actually the tight end, his safety valve, Kate Stover, to me has played like a top 5 tight end in the country this year, and was actually the highest graded Power 5 tight end last week in the country. But to me, it comes down to 2 things. Kyle McCord. I know some of the counting stats are looking good right now. He's up to like number 6 in QBR. I know he was graded out well last week. To my eyes, I still don't see it, and maybe I'm seeing something that other people, call me crazy, but I just see continually I see like wide receivers, tight ends having to contort their body to make a reception, and I think it's more of the receivers and tight ends making McCord look better. I mean, I don't know how many times Harrison has to stop on a route or slow down his route. He's not hitting stride. Maybe my expectations for Ohio State quarterbacks for the last 6-7 years has put too much expectations on McCord, but I still think there's an issue there. And I'm all about narratives, and the narrative is, he's finding himself. He really took a step on that drive against Notre Dame. Reality is Notre Dame defensive back dropped an interception. If he doesn't, what's the narrative around this Ohio State offense if that's a loss in South Bend? So I still have my concerns there. Offensive line, to me, I know Fryer and Jones have graded out well, but to me, I just go to basic counting stats. Ohio State can't run the ball consistently, and it would help having healthy running backs, but the reality is I don't care who's at running back. When you're only running for 135 yards a game, you can't run against Maryland, 4.3 yards per carry. I mean, that's the lowest of the Buckeyes in 2 decades. So some of the numbers look okay, success rates, EPA per plays, but this is the best defense that they've faced, or at least right there with Notre Dame, a game that they struggled with. And speaking of the Penn State defense, you're talking about a defense, even though they haven't played anybody, you can't control who you play once the schedule is set, but you can control how you play. Number 1 in success rate, number 1 in EPA per play. I found this remarkable. when you're number one in the country in scoring margin, obviously you're going to be rotating a bunch of players because, you're dealing with a bunch of blowouts. 15 different Penn State players have a sack already this season. Halfway through the season, 15 guys have a sack. That's incredible to me. Isaac leads the way there. I got to tell you, though, it's tough getting a gauge on how good this. I think the defense is good. I like Manny Diaz as a defense coordinator, not a head coach, defense coordinator. He's done a good job here the couple years. But when your offenses that you faced, Northwestern, Iowa, Illinois, Delaware, UMass, West Virginia, I don't know if we got a good gauge of just how good this defense is. Is this clearly the number one or number two defense in the country like a lot of the counting stats say? I don't know. We'll find out on Saturday. It's Ohio State, even with some of the struggles, and Ohio State, even though not as good as maybe some recent Buckeye additions as far as the offense goes, this is still the best offense by far that Penn State's seen this season. So to me, you test the Penn State defense. You throw it. You try to get Harrison involved immediately. Take a couple shots down the field and see, if this secondary for Penn State, which lost some key components from last year. I know they've recruited well and they got a couple transfer portal guys, but let's just see how good they are. And that's what I'm doing for Ohio State. I get aggressive actually early in the game.
How concerned, Brad, should we be when we look at Manny Diaz's track record? And to your point, he has excelled in every metric you'd want a defense to do so with the schedule Penn State has played. But you look at when he stepped up in class last year, they gave up 42.5 points per game against Ohio State and Michigan. I know this edition of Ohio State not nearly as explosive as what we saw last year with C.J. Stroud at the trigger. But at the same time, do you worry that Penn State is going to find this a little bit of a jolt to the system? Or just from an eye test and everything you've seen in spring, that you think they're up for this challenge?
It's a great question. I'm not sure that I have a definitive answer. Yeah, it's certainly a concern. The Buckeye game last year doesn't concern me as much as the Michigan game last year did, when Michigan ran for over 400 yards and literally pummeled Penn State.
I had a Michigan ticket in that game. It wasn't fun to watch, let me tell you.
Yeah. I'm a little concerned, but I'm not sure this Buckeye offense, from what I've seen, is going to fully expose. Even with Ohio State's offense being the best one that Penn State's seen, I'm not sure this Buckeye offense is going to fully expose if there are really true warts on this Penn State defense. But it's a concern when you haven't played anybody, and we're sitting here in mid-October, and I'm again, what's the best offense they face? West Virginia? That's pretty pathetic.
Yeah, there is no doubt about it that while Penn State has gone out there and done what you'd want them to do against an inferior schedule of opponents, you still would like to see one useful data point that you could hang your hat on when you go into a game of this magnitude. Obviously, with two teams that have aspirations of not just winning the Big Ten East or the Big Ten, but getting themselves into the college football playoff. From the Big Ten to the ACC, and it's Clemson going on the road to South Florida to take on the Miami Hurricanes. Clemson enters the contest a modest 3.5-point road favorite. Total on the game 48.5. And this will be a matchup between the ACC's top defense in Clemson against the top offense in the Miami Hurricanes. When you look at just a yards per game standpoint, Clemson has won 4 straight versus Miami. Their last loss against the Hurricanes came back in 2010. And during that 4-game win streak, they've outscored the Canes 178-30, seeking their 5th straight win over Miami for the first time in program history. Meanwhile, Miami on the flip side, they're just looking for their first conference home win under head coach Mario Cristobal. Need a win to avoid their first 0-3 start in conference play in program history. They did take a 17-14 lead into the half last week in Chapel Hill before allowing 3 Drake May passing touchdowns in the third quarter in what amounted to a 10-point loss. Injuries for Clemson, it appears they're going to be a little bit healthier if you trust what Dabo Swinney has said during the bye week. He claims that everyone will be available in some capacity, and that could include Nate Wiggins, Sheridan Jones, and Antonio Williams, who have missed extensive time. Brad, when you look at this Clemson offense, they're averaging just 20 points per game against their 4 ACC opponents. I think the most flattering adjective I can use to describe their performance against Wake was workmanlike, because they didn't show big play potential. They weren't explosive. Cade Klubnik finished 18-28 for 131 yards. Will Shipley averaged less than 5 yards per carry. And while we knew there was going to be a transition into Garrett Riley's offense, they're still looking for their first 300-yard passing game and 70% plus completion percentage outing from Cade Klubnik. Clemson's offense against the Hurricanes defense, which is the matchup you're looking to try and exploit if you're the Tigers devising a game plan?
Well, I do give the edge here to Miami in this one. Although we'll get to Miami. I do have some concerns, especially when they've taken a step up in class so far. But I'm not sure that this Clemson offense is a step up in class because I go back to the opener on the Duke game. Sideline reporter on the game pretty much said, there was something that he said that was just striking to me. He's sitting there in the pregame warm-ups, watching them go through drills, and then obviously how the game played out. And he basically said he didn't see much of a difference athletically, skill, size between Clemson and Duke. And that, to me, all that has done since then is shown up on film with Clemson, particularly at the skill position. I don't see a Taj Boyd or a Watson or Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. There's no ETN type player at running back. There's no Sammy Watkins, Hopkins at wide receiver. Klubnik, you expected him to take some progress and some steps going from a freshman to a sophomore in this new system, and the reality is he hasn't. Number 56 in QBR, played and looked like an average quarterback to me. At running back, I like Shipley and Maffa. They're good to me. Good 1-2 punch. They're not great. They're not taking over a ball game and winning it for you. I mean, the most concerning thing to me on the offense is the wide receiver position. And you probably should have gotten a hint in that Duke game when they're relying on early in the season, when they're relying on a kid, Tyler Brown, who was one of their lowest rated recruits in the true freshman class. Nothing against the kid. It's just, a 3-star freshman is one of your top 3 wide receivers. Don't see much of explosiveness there from Collins. Antonio Williams has been a disappointment after a really good freshman season. He hasn't taken that jump from a freshman to sophomore. And when you're looking at, what's Miami's weakness? Payne has mentioned it. Miami's got a lot of guys on defense, but if there's a weakness, it's at cornerback. I'm not sure that this wide receiver core for Clemson can fully take advantage of it, of Miami's weakness. So to me, not only are the Jimmies and Joes not there, I think another disappointing aspect for this Clemson offense this year is we expected a lot from Garrett Riley, and the X's and O's to me have not lived up to expectations. Just haven't seen it. I don't know. He's got a restrictor plate on him as far as, what he can call and can't call because of the Clemson way or whatever, but I haven't seen it. And then you would expect this offense to take a step against this is one of the worst Wake Forest teams in the last 6-7 years. And yet in that game, Clemson loses 2 fumbles, missed a field goal, finished with 338 yards, their lowest of the season. I don't see it from this Clemson offense, and I'm not sure we're going to see it on Saturday night. On the other side, I have seen some things on Miami when they're not, especially when they're playing the Bethune-Cookmans and the Temples of the world. They do have some talent. Safeties position, Williams and Kitchens, very good. They got a deep rotation on the defensive line. That Ruben Bain kid I've talked about with Payne off the air. That's a good-looking true freshman defensive end. Cornerback, again, like I mentioned, is a concern. A&M exposed it a little bit. North Carolina certainly did in the second half, but I'm not sure Clemson's capable of exposing some of the weaknesses here for Miami. So I'm giving the edge to the Hurricanes here on this matchup.
One of the areas Miami addressed in the wake of that loss against North Carolina as well was their tackling, saying that was about as sloppy a performance as they've seen from that team defensively all season. So no doubt Lance Gidger will want this team to be a lot more physical, especially at the line of scrimmage, knowing that what Will Shipley and Maffa lack in some of that big play potential, they have shown an ability to run through contact. We'll see how all of that plays out. Now, Payne, when we look at Miami coming into the year, we thought this offense was going to be improved. And when you look at some of the counting stats, there's no doubt that they've been better. Tyler Van Dyke leads the ACC in completion percentage, north of 70%, yards per attempt, passing efficiency, and is tied with Haynes King with 16 passing touchdowns. But look, let's not, bury the lead by any stretch of the imagination. When you dig into what Tyler Van Dyke has done over his last 2 games, 5 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and it's the first 2 games of the campaign where he's completed less than 70% of his passes. Also the first 2 games with a sub-90 QPR. What are ACC defenses doing to try and slow down Shannon Dawson's Tyler Van Dyke-led Miami attack, knowing that the weapons are better on paper for the Hurricanes, but something isn't clicking in its full capacity when they've stepped up in class?
You're setting me up, huh?
I'm trying.
Rip the Band-Aid off here and divulge the truth.
You don't have to divulge any truth. That's why I keep the questions open-ended.
So one of the things is Tyler Van Dyke is certainly dealing with a few things. showed up to practice with his leg wrapped and walked with the leg completely locked on Monday. And we saw Mario Cristobal get a little snippy with a reporter and said, he's playing. I wouldn't doubt that. I mean, Mario played Van Dyke in last year's FSU game, at best, 60% health. And then last week in a 3-score game with 2 minutes to go against UNC, Van Dyke is still out there. Probably not public, but I'm also told Van Dyke is playing with 3 torn ligaments in his throwing hand. And apparently that sounds worse than it actually is, but if you're looking for confirmation, go to the 10:42 mark of the third quarter of last week's North Carolina game, and on the fumbled snap, you'll see the replay of Van Dyke reaching for the loose ball, and he's got black tape over a couple of the digits there. Specific to the matchup, this is certainly Miami's toughest test. This isn't an opener against a Mac or Bethune-Cookman or Temple or UNC secondary outside the top 90 in explosive passing allowed, or an A&M secondary outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed. Is a top 10 Clemson pass defense that's had 2 weeks to prepare. And you mentioned some of the injuries, I believe, introducing the game, where one of the country's best corners in Nate Wiggins should be back. I heard that he warmed up in advance of the Wake game. The range of opinion from pro bettors on the Miami Hurricanes seems just massive, right? And what's bizarre about that is I don't think anybody upgraded Miami more than Brad and I year over year coming into the season. So suddenly, I'm just trying to figure out, where the discrepancy comes from. But it's kind of wild to say that after 6 data points. I think we learned more about Miami's offense in this game than any other. I mean, I go back to the best defensive line on Miami's schedule to date. It was Texas A&M. Not a single Miami offensive lineman had a run block grade above replacement level against the Aggies. Miami averaged 1.4 yards per rush before first contact. Running backs had an 89 rushing yards on 22 carries that included 4 explosives, which means 82% of Miami's run plays against Texas A&M went for a grand total of 34 yards. Could not run the ball against Georgia Tech, despite them presenting more of coverage looks than loaded boxes. I look at Tyler Van Dyke. Dude has a howitzer. The accuracy continues to improve. He is Chris Kyle-like, if you...
Solid reference out of
kind
there.
of. I mean, the dude's just awesome if he knows where to go with the football and he doesn't have to think. If you look at Shannon Dawson, massive upgrade over Josh Gatz.
Who isn't?
Dawson's actually... Right, but think about even last week's game, right? He's scheming guys wide open. I mean, how good is that first Restrepo TD in terms of scheme? Like, there's no one within 10 yards of the guy. Ridiculous throw by TVD to George for the second touchdown, but it's a one-read throw. I mean, Dawson's done a fantastic job getting TVD looks pre-snap that allow him to go to his first read. But when he doesn't have his first read and he's forced to pat the ball and go through the progressions, Tyler Van Dyke's a shell of himself. So it wouldn't shock me if Clemson initially tries to stop the run with 6 in the box like they did against Florida State, like they saw Georgia Tech be able to do, and play more coverage to start. I also wonder through 6 data points if defenses are starting to catch on to Miami's lack of diversity. I mean, I love Restrepo, right? He's Van Dyke's guy, roommates, best of friends. He's easier to find than Deion Sanders, okay? I mean, he's lining up in the slot on 96% of snaps. You look at Jacoby George, he's the clear-cut deep guy, 50% of his targets, 10-plus yards. Colby Young, he's the gadget guy. Receiver screens, crossers, nearly 60% of Colby Young's targets are inside of 9 yards. That's it. Every single receiver has basically an area of which they catch the ball, and I think people are starting to catch on. They tell me Miami's tight end Miami tight ends have a grand total of 5 catches all season. Maybe as Arroyo gets healthier, that changes. Running backs are nothing more than an afterthought in the pass game. So there's just not a ton of diversity right now on offense. 3-game losing streak on the line. Miami's had a 3-game losing streak in 12 of the last 17 seasons. Miami hasn't beaten an ACC opponent at home in the Cristobal era. To me, this feels like the most important game of Cristobal's tenure to date. I wish I liked Clemson's offense. That's the problem for me here. right? That's the reality of the situation.
Hey, it's a fair way to look at it. There is no doubt about it. I mean, Brad laid out the case for why Clemson's offense has underwhelmed, and that may not be a strong enough choice in word there to describe what we've seen through the first handful of games with Garrett Riley at the controls and Cade Klubnik not realizing potential, or maybe he is, and he's just not that guy. Meanwhile, we'll see if Miami can bounce back dealing with a level of adversity in a game where the number has remained pretty steady, just north of a field goal and a total sitting in the high 40s. We won't leave.
You know what we've learned, guys? You know what we've learned? Clemson laying 6.5 at Syracuse was a fantastic bet. Because now you're sitting here having to lay 4 at Pinnacle on Clemson. Like what a good bet that was. I wish we had bet more on that.
I think
that's kind of what we've learned.
I think what we've learned is laying any number against Syracuse the last 3 weeks would be a positive bet given the way that Syracuse is in absolute shambles. But yes, that is
had we known Dino was going to punt last week, that was very much a let's stay healthy, boys. Let's see if we can make a bowl and get out of Dodge type game against Florida State. Had we known that, would have been easier to bet last week.
More or less waving the white flag as Syracuse limps into the bye week, to say the least. When we look elsewhere in the ACC, there is another marquee game taking place at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific on ABC between Duke and the Florida State Seminoles. This will mark the third meeting between a ranked Florida State and Duke team, the first since 2013. When you look at the previous 2 meetings, Florida State has boat raced the Blue Devils in those contests, winning those games by an average of 39 points per and scoring 52 points per game in those games. You look at Duke, it's their highest AP ranking of 16 since 1994. They started 5-1 or better for the first time since 2018. They did start 5-1, but finished 8-5 in Daniel Jones' senior season. Meanwhile, you look at Florida State, 21-0 all-time versus Duke. It's the second most wins by an FBS team without a loss versus a single opponent, only bested by LSU against Louisiana Lafayette. Florida State scored 40-plus in 18 of the 21 meetings. They've won by 20-plus in 19 of the 21 meetings. The only win by single digits came in 2017, where Florida State snuck by the Blue Devils 17-10. Florida State actually comes into the game with the third longest winning streak in the FBS, seeking their first 7-0 start since 2014 when famous Jameis was under center. Meanwhile, the Noles, they've been dominant at home. Winners of 3 straight home games, all by 20-plus points for the first time since the 2013-2014 campaign. There is a level of coaching familiarity. Duke's offensive coordinator, Kevin Johns, coached for Mike Norvell while at Memphis. And Payne, when we look at the Duke offense, I can give all of the stats in the world, but there's one question that hasn't been answered yet that all of us are waiting for. Who will be the starting quarterback for the Blue Devils under the lights at the Doak on Saturday night?
Pete Thamel said Riley Leonard is no longer on crutches or with a walking boot. But I have not heard that Leonard is fully participating in practice, and I think the market is saying he's out with a spread of 14. And you and I spoke last night a little bit, and you just start to wonder if it makes sense trotting out a 65%, 70%, 72% healthy Riley Leonard, whatever it is, and you're not really allowing him to use his best attribute or fully protect himself in a game where odds makers are giving Duke about a 20% chance to win. Right? There is a path where losing to FSU on Saturday night is fine, and then getting Riley Leonard a little bit more healthy and handling business the rest of the way still gets you to an ACC championship game because you do have that head-to-head matchup with North Carolina. To me, the matchup on this side of the ball is really straightforward. Duke's going to employ its RPO game with Henry Beelan and Jordan Waters and Jacquez Moore. When Beelan does throw it, it's going to be action assisted, right? It's going to be a throw over the middle if backers are cheating too far down. It's a quick screen or it's a deep shot. Kevin Johns isn't going to ask the world of Henry Beelan in the most hostile environment he's ever played in, but it's pretty simple here. Can Duke run the football? If they can, they'll be able to slow the game down, limit the snaps, hike up the variance with their pace, which is outside the top 90, and then can Duke connect on the occasional deep shot? This is really interesting in terms of how professional bettors are gauging Florida State. From what I see to the naked eye and the information that I get internally, and you compare it to the data, Florida State's improving against the run. And there is noise in a lot of their numbers because the Noles are rotating so much trying to keep guys healthy. They understand the goal this year. It is win the ACC championship. It is get a playoff berth. They're fully cognizant that they don't have enough frontline players to compete against the best playoff teams. So the ones they do have, they're trying to keep healthy. So if you look in the non-LSU and Clemson games, or the flu game at Boston College, which got very dicey, look at the snap counts. Jared Verse is averaging 31 snaps in non-key games. Fabian Lovett, 26. Braden Fisk, 26. Josh Farmer, 20. If they wanted to beat Virginia Tech or Syracuse by 60, they could, right? So FSU, if you look at their numbers, still outside the top 35 in defensive line yards and rushing success rate allowed this season. But there's, again, there's some noise in those numbers. FSU missed 13 tackles last week. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that Duke can get something going on the ground. Florida State hired a new secondary coach in Patrick Surtain. Huge hit, both in the locker room, teaching, and on the trail. But his corners are playing more aggressive man coverage. And so Florida State's outside the top 75 in explosive pass defense this season. So that's the path. You got to be able to run the ball if you're Duke, slow this game down, occasionally attack Florida State's linebackers who aren't great in coverage, occasionally hit the explosive pass if there's a bust in man coverage. It's 3 to 4 yards a pop on the ground, live in third and short, hit the timely explosive. Can Duke consistently execute that? I'm not so sure. You mentioned the good amount of familiarity here. Mike Norvell hired Kevin Johns at Memphis in 2019, and then you think about the matchup. This is going to be the third consecutive week Florida State's faced an RPO-based offense with a mobile quarterback in a ground game. I don't know how effective it's going to be.
Look, I watched Henry Beelan last week, albeit in a downpour against NC State, and you could tell that they had really simplified the game plan, knowing that they didn't fear what MJ Morris and company could do on the other side. Beelan attempted just one pass in the second half, finished that game 4-12. Obviously going to have to do a whole heck of a lot more in this particular spot if he is indeed the man under center for the Duke Blue Devils. Meanwhile, Brad, when we look at Duke, I think their defense deserves a ton of credit. Now, they haven't played the most grueling of schedules by any stretch of the imagination, but much like Penn State, they've answered the bell when called upon. 9.8 points per game allowed this season. It's the fourth fewest in the FBS, second fewest by any Duke program through 6 games in the last 50 seasons. When you look at their pass defense, they fared extremely well, it being the best in the ACC in that regard. But as far as opposing offenses faced, it's Clemson, who's 81st, Lafayette, which is an FBS program, Northwestern, 84th, UConn, 103rd. Notre Dame was a step up in class at 56th. And, of course, NC State outside the top 100 played in a downpour. Have you seen enough from Duke defensively that would lead you to believe they can slow down Florida State's playmakers, knowing the Noles should be healthier at the wide receiver position this week than they were last week with the expected return of Johnny Wilson opposite Keon Coleman?
In a word, no. I mean, I think it's more about Florida State than it is about Duke in this matchup and whether or not Florida State can be consistent. I'll start, though, with the Duke defense. You kind of led into it a little bit. I mean, obviously, you don't have a lot of 4- and 5-star kids on this defense. But what you do have are a bunch of 20- and 21-year-old kids that have played several seasons of college football. They have an elite scheme. This is their second year in the Elko scheme. They rotate a lot of guys, particularly on the defensive line. They can generate pressure from different guys across the board on the front seven. Secondary does have a couple of transfers that were at more higher level places, like an Al Blades from Miami, Miles Jones from A&M. So there is a little bit of talent there. Obviously, the counting stats say that this is one of the better defenses in the country. More of the analytics, the success rates, EPA per play. It's a good defense, not great, but I think mainly it might be due to the opposing schedule. And that's saying something. Oh, well, they played Notre Dame, they played Clemson. But keep in mind, Clemson moved the football against Duke. It was red zone issues for Clemson and not anything that Duke was doing. I mean, Clemson just fumble and snaps and stuff like that inside the 10-yard line. Notre Dame, you mentioned maybe an upgraded pass attack that Duke faced in that game. Well, this is why it's important. I mean, a lot of people, and there's noise in these stats and whatnot, I think it's important to make the manual adjustments like Payne says. Notre Dame in that game was completely compromised at wide receiver.
Great point. Great point, Brad.
And already below average Notre Dame wide receiver unit that was missing 3 of their top 5 guys. So I still have some doubts about just how good Duke is. I know Elko's good, and I know this is an experienced bunch of players, but the reality is this is the best offense by far they've faced. And even Notre Dame and Clemson still had, if you dive into the numbers, had some success, on certain drives. Notre Dame and Clemson were able to run the football against this Duke defense. Flipping over to the other side, to me, it's tough saying this because the Florida State's offense has scored at least 30 points in 12 straight games. And Payne mentioned it, not only on defense, but offensively. They've been rotating a lot of guys, not a lot of heavy snap counts. Haven't been able to find that consistency that I'd like to see outside of Keon Coleman, who's played like a first-team All-American, not only a wide receiver, but also in the punt return game. I'm anxious to see if, always with Norvell, I'm anxious to see how he attacks things because I do consider him to be one of the better X's and O's guys in the country. I think he can work the tight end against this Duke defense, especially with Jaheim Bell, very versatile tight end, because I go back to the Notre Dame game. Notre Dame's compromised at wide receiver. Duke knows that Notre Dame has to go to the tight end, and yet Notre Dame's tight end, Mitchell Evans, hurt them consistently. When the whole stadium knows that the ball's going to probably Mitchell Evans and he's still getting touches, that's a concern for me if I'm a Duke backer here. I think Bell can have a big game. Also, Florida State should be healthier in this game. The Florida State Insider, the appropriately named Payne Insider, says that Johnny Wilson at wide receiver, after missing last week, should be back here. And Bless Harris on the offensive line should be back. Offensive line, I thought Payne, again, hit the nail on the head when we were talking about this offensive line in the summer. A lot of experience. Maybe not anybody elite, but they have more depth than what they've had at any point in the last 5-6 years. And they should be fresher than most offensive lines down the stretch here with limited snap counts so far. To me, I just need some consistency out of Florida State on a possession in and possession out basis. And to me, I think they get the upper hand, provided they don't have a 2-3 turnover type of game. I think they have the upper hand here. Obviously, and I didn't even mention it, the guy that runs the quarterback, Jordan Travis. I think if he's kind of hasn't had that breakout game, I think it's capable in a magnitude like this, especially if Duke has to force the issue on the other side of the ball. I think Florida State can pounce on him here. I like the Noles in this game.
You mentioned turnovers, Brad, and Florida State's actually been remarkably good in that department all year. Just 3 turnovers this season, tied for the second fewest in the FBS behind Oregon with 1. And they've gone 3 straight games without a turnover for the first time as a program since 2019. Have not gone 4 straight games without one since 2015, which amounted to a 5-game streak. But, gentlemen, we're not done with this game just yet, but because you two are the best at what you do, I'll create an open-ended question so either you can jump in. Obviously, we're speculating about Riley Leonard's status. Payne, you mentioned the fact that this number suggests he's out. If Riley Leonard is officially ruled out in this game, does the number continue to climb? Do we assume the total comes down? Where do we think the next move is based on Riley Leonard's health update?
I think it would tick up. I think this line says he's doubtful. I wouldn't say this line says he's out, at least according to my numbers. Although I'm a little bit higher in the market on Florida State than everybody else the last couple of weeks.
Can I ask you real quick, Brad, in terms of an overall downgrade? Obviously a limited sample size in Henry Beeline. Riley Leonard, about a 7-point downgrade. More aggressive, not aggressive enough.
Yep, in line with that. I made it 6, and I'm usually conservative in those.
No, fair assessment, as I know a lot of listeners who will tune in, maybe not when this podcast goes live Wednesday afternoon, but listen on Friday and Saturday who may have a little bit more information at their disposal, want that question kind of out there. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me. And most importantly, follow all things Bet the Board at Bet the Board Pod. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter. Absolutely free, delivered right to your inbox every single Friday throughout the fall. And while we do have a couple of other big Power 5 games to get to, Brad, this is your time to shine, and you've been white hot in this department over the last handful of weeks when we go a little bit off the radar to a non-Powers 5 game. And this week, you're taking us to the sunny locale of Boca Raton, Florida, where it's the UTSA Roadrunners, a 3.5-point road favorite, taking on Tom Herman's Florida Atlantic Owls. Total on this game sits at 60.
Yeah, we're going to take the home underdog here. FAU plus the 3.5, the all-important hook on a key number. But to me, I think this is another game, like I mentioned last week, got an underdog that's live here because basic counting stats to me, FAU slightly better. Yards per play margin, better in yards per game margin, better in scoring margin, played a little bit of a tougher schedule. I know UTSA has a couple data points without their all-everything quarterback, Frank Harris. But to me, let's look about what UTSA has done since he returned. Looks good because they got a couple of nice offensive performances against Temple and UAB. Covered both games, but, man, dive into them. They got outgained by Temple. I watched that game. That game probably should have came down to the wire if Temple was played a little bit cleaner game. UAB game looks like a blowout. I don't know. UAB outgained UTSA. Really came down to turnovers in both games. UTSA was +2 in both games. I also am looking this time of year for fundamental changes, not necessarily always personnel driven, but in this instance on the FAU side, I got a first-year coach in Tom Herman. Not the greatest of starts. They did play a relatively tougher schedule than expected. Obviously, Clemson, Illinois, Ohio's better than expected. Off the bye, they look like they've done some things. The Tulsa game, even though it was played in a monsoon there for a little bit during that game, figured some things out, had over 200 yards rushing. And then last week, the offense exploded against South Florida, nearly 600 yards, 56 points, very well balanced. Defensive side of the ball, they're getting pressure on the quarterback, 12 sacks the last 3 games. Herman, home underdog, better defense here with FAU. I like FAU quite a bit here, plus the 3.5, even though the market kind of leaned towards UTSA early in the week. I disagree.
You know, when you look at this FAU team, I know a lot of our listeners out there probably haven't watched this team in any capacity, but as far as skill position talent, Larry McCammon at running back starting to flash a little bit, but the player you're going to want to watch if you tune into this game is LeJohntay Wester. 62 receptions so far this season, 622 yards. It's always crazy when we look at some of these skill position players. You know where the ball is going. It still doesn't matter. Teams aren't able to stop him, and it's a credit to the way Tom Herman has schemed things up so far, doing all of this with a backup quarterback in Daniel Richardson after they lost Casey Thompson early in the year. And I think, Brad, the point you made resonates completely. They had to reinvent themselves based on the quarterback skill sets, and maybe we're just starting to realize how good this team can be with an offensive identity. Do you think they have a legitimate shot to contend as a bit of a dark horse in the AAC alongside the Memphises, the Tulanes, and the SMUs to maybe get to that conference championship game?
They certainly have the ability to. I mean, especially, I don't think Memphis is well coached. UAB's been a disappointment. UTSA, the team they're playing this week, has been a disappointment. You know, outside of Tulane and SMU offensively has left a little bit to be desired. I wouldn't put them in that championship game, but they're certainly. I don't think they're totally outclassed by anybody they play in this conference. And look, Tom Herman got fired at Texas. I don't think he's that bad of a coach, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, this guy's got 2 major bowl wins under his relatively young resume already. I think they're onto something here. And keep in mind, there was a big disagreement about this team in the summer. I was actually on the negative side on the FAU win total, unlike a lot of people like the over and like the returning experience in this team. So in my numbers, and when I've been negative on FAU all year, and all of a sudden my numbers are positive, that kind of raises my eyebrows here.
You know what this does mean, Brad? With you going off the radar picking this game, we may need Payne to get in his car and drive up to Boca to be in attendance if that's what it's going to take to get us across the finish line. So Payne, 6 o'clock Eastern time, we're going to expect to see you in the stadium on the sidelines, on the headsets if need be, should Tom Herman struggle to get this team going on their opening few drives of the game.
I have a commitment at 7:30 p.m. that evening.
Well, that's even more.
Florida State is playing, but I do enjoy Brad's coming around. Brad is very much a Florida guy. He mentioned, I don't know if you knew this or not, but Mike Norvell's classic line of "It's about us," and now he's heading down to South Florida for the best bet. I mean, he's becoming a Florida guy.
I do have family in Florida. I've been to Florida quite a bit. I like it. Don't love it, but I like it.
I mean, look.
And Payne, we didn't need you to drive up to Buffalo last week to get BG home with an outright winner. We don't need Jim Boca to get to the window here.
That is true.
Look, let's not kid ourselves, Brad. The weather in Buffalo starts to become too cold for Payne once you get past August 15th. So that's the reality of once the mercury goes under 75, Payne will not set foot in a city unless he absolutely is required to do so by law or in some capacity. But guys, it should be plenty warm this weekend in the Pac-12 And maybe if you believe the LA Times, the seat under Lincoln Riley is plenty warm because you lose to Notre Dame 48-20, which was one of the more ridiculous headlines I think I read about the ongoing rebuilding project that we're seeing at Southern Cal. It's USC a touchdown favorite as they've taken a little bit of money in the market here on a Wednesday morning. Total in the game 56 as they welcome in a familiar foe and one that has had their number in recent meetings. But Utah is seeking their first ever win against a ranked USC team on the road. They're looking to extend the program record win streak versus USC to 4. The last loss against the Trojans came back in 2020. Meanwhile, for USC, all is not lost when you lose a non-conference game against Notre Dame, albeit in somewhat disappointing fashion. They're still seeking their first 5-0 start in the Pac-12 since 2020. They're 11-0 at home under Lincoln Riley, averaging an FBS best 48.9 points per game since he took over. They're also coming in off their worst margin defeat as an AP top 10 team since 1995, where they lost at Notre Dame, also in that game by 28 points. They finished the turnover battle -5 in South Bend. And when you look at Lincoln Riley's comments, disappointed, certainly not defeated, not demoralized. We've obviously got a lot in front of us. This game means a lot. We know it means a lot to our fan base. It means a lot to college football. And if Lincoln Riley is going to get things turned around, this team has to be a hell of a lot more buttoned up and focused on what they're not doing, especially early in games. But Brad, for a much maligned USC defense, that wasn't their Achilles heel against Notre Dame. It was the fact that they were put in compromising positions, dealing with short fields. This week they get a Utah offense that, for lack of a better word, lacks firepower, to say the least. Bryson Barnes took over last week, but it was the ground game that completely beat up and obliterated that Cal defensive front. But against USC, does Utah have enough firepower to keep this game inside the number and have a chance to keep the win streak against the Trojans from Southern Cal headed in the right direction?
Yeah, I'm not totally confident on either side. Obviously, this is the matchup with the two teams' clear weaknesses is matched up here. Obviously, when you look at the scoreboard, you'd say, oh, typical USC defense last week. But, I mean, Notre Dame only had 251 yards. It's tough to get a lot of yards when Notre Dame starts at the USC 12, USC 2, the 50, the USC 14. Notre Dame didn't score on all those drives. So I'm not sure if the USC defense really, truly turned a corner last week. My goodness, this year, whenever, you don't have to be Einstein to figure out some of the issues. I mean, when you just look up, who's leading the team in tackles? When 3 of them are safeties, that's not a good sign. When that clearly means that teams are getting to the second level and third levels of the defense, especially when you're counting on undersized guys to have to make tackles in space. That's why you're one of the worst tackling grade teams in the country. They've been able to get pressure for most of the season, Solomon Byrd, Muhammad, but 0 against Notre Dame, 0 sacks when they needed them to make a big play and maybe force a field goal instead of a touchdown there on those off those turnovers and those. They just couldn't get it done there in the pass rush, so that concerns me a little bit. Obviously, success rate, number 63, EPA per play, number 98, number 84 in explosives, all bad, but all better than Utah's offense in those particular categories, because Utah 90th in success rate, number 117 in EPA per play, number 132 in explosives. I mean, this has been a big-time struggling offense, to say the least. Starting with, obviously, you don't have your starting quarterback and you expected him, not going to see him. I think that's pretty much become apparent here the last couple of weeks. I will say this, coming off the bye, what does a good coaching staff do? They tweak some things, and we did see some tweaks last week. Number 1, Barnes got the start at quarterback, got banged up against Oregon State, probably played his best game. Not saying much, but still, the big thing is completed his passes 71%, 0 turnovers, 0 sacks. And the red zone for Utah. In limited red zone opportunities, that was much better. 5 of 6 last week. They were 1 out of 3 in the red zone the previous 2 games combined. Jaquindon Jackson is their top running back, but it was actually a converted safety that they used last week. Vaki, who played safety for him last week as well, but also they went ahead and put him in the run game, and he gave him a little bit of a different punch there. And by punch, I mean a guy that could hit some explosives. When he averaged 10.5 yards per carry, led by a long touchdown run, looked like Eric Weddle back there playing safety and running back for the Utes. They were able to get push finally on that offensive line, over 300 yards rushing. Will they be able to do it against SC? I'm not sure. I mean, I will say this. I mean, if Stanford, Colorado, and Arizona can run on USC, Utah probably could have some success here. The problem is how many guys is USC going to be able to put in the box? I would like to guess 7 or 8.
13?
Yeah, 13. Because there's just nothing at wide receiver and tight end. Even last year, okay, they have average wide receivers at best at Utah. At least they had a go-to tight end last year. They don't have it. And, in fact, their top tight end just got ruled out for the rest of the season. That Yasmin kid who had a touchdown catch in the Pac-12 championship game against SC. So I just don't see it. Money Parks catches a 70-yard touchdown pass in the first play of the season for Utah against Florida. Hasn't done anything. He's got less than 100 yards total since that catch for the rest of the year. So, and to me, it all comes down to this. Maybe the entire game is this. Can Utah run the ball? They'll get their yardage just because, I mean, they're going to try to run it probably 40 plus times. Can they get the 200 yards? If they can, then this game's close. If they can't, then they can't keep pace as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, you mentioned Money Parks. He was the big receiver in the Pac-12 championship game, had 4 catches for 88 yards, one of those being a 57-yard reception. But the tight end position has always been an area that Utah has been able to exploit, at least in recent meetings against this very USC Trojans group. No greater illustration than what we saw from Dalton Kincaid in the game played in Salt Lake City during the regular season, where he finished with 16 catches for 234 yards. He ain't walking through that door anytime soon to try and rejuvenate a Utah passing attack that's really lacked punch on a week-in, week-out basis. But Payne, on the other side of the ball, we have strength on strength, at least theoretically, if USC's offense bounces back. They've scored 30-plus points in every home game under Lincoln Riley. The lowest offensive output was a 30-14 win versus Washington State. They lead the Pac-12, and they're second in the FBS with 50 plays of 20-plus yards this season. Utah is last in that department, as Brad highlighted, and 129th in the FBS with just 16. Caleb Williams, if he is this transcendent talent, the bona fide number 1 pick in the draft, has to bounce back and play with a chip on his shoulder, get the ball to Washington, Rice, and Williams in space. Utah's defense, the counting stats look great. They've been able to answer the bell when called upon, but things may be a little bit more difficult in the first half when they're down the leader of their defense, because what I thought was an absolute trash targeting penalty handed off to Cole Bishop against Cal.
Starts with Caleb Williams, right? That seems evident here. And I wish I would have said it last week with a mic in front of my face, but I know we talked off air heading into the Notre Dame game, and I didn't really hold back because I've seen a ton of bad habits pop up this season, right? I mean, Caleb Williams has fallen in love with the lazy throws. The no-step sidearm is the patented move of his from shotgun now, incessantly throwing off the back foot. Rarely is Caleb Williams ever set when he throws, and I get it. Like, one of his best attributes is improvisation. But if you look right now, Caleb is rarely playing within structure, and it's the reason he's got 13 turnover-worthy plays through 7 games. Had only 11 in 14 games last season. It just looks like lazy, sloppy football out there. Now, there was a quote from Lincoln Riley on Tuesday I found interesting. He said, "The biggest thing for us is that we've just got to get back to playing more 11-man ball. The results have not consistently been there because there's not been a lot of 11-man ball offensively." And it's a very calculated shot at his quarterback. And I think Lincoln Riley sees it, and that Caleb Williams is basically playing backyard football. And if you can fix that a little bit, right, because you're going to get away with it when you're playing shit out of conference opponents or bottom feeder Pac-12 teams. You're not going to when the schedule gets a little bit tougher. We saw that last week with Notre Dame. The crazy part for me is when Caleb Williams is playing within structure and he's getting the ball out on time, which helps him throw from clean pockets. He's performing better this season than last, if you can believe it. So it's a positive sign the more stable quarterback metrics have improved. It's under pressure where Caleb's fallen off a cliff. Adjusted accuracy under pressure is down 7%. All 13 of Caleb Williams' turnover-worthy plays are when he's pressured. He had just 4 all last season when pressured, right? That's not really a stable QB metric. Part of this is on Lincoln Riley as well. Hasn't found the right 5 up front, right? There isn't a ton of cohesion. He had 2 returning starters, a left tackle and a center. Brought in 3 key cog transfers. He moved his 2 returning starters to different positions along the line, and the 3 new transfers Lincoln brought in are playing different positions than they did last season. 2 of them weren't initially starting. Now they're starting. So you got to get the front figured out a little bit here as well. But I think seeing Utah, based upon some of the quotes you had there, Todd, at the top, might allow USC to refocus a little bit quicker off the loss. You lost both games to Utah last season. On paper, Utah's front looks like it could give USC a world of trouble. In totality, right, this is a Utah defense that's allowing roughly 30% of opponent snaps to great successful. Metrically, Utah can get after the quarterback. They can stop the run. They can play the pass. Now, I'm interested to see what this looks like in this matchup because Utah hasn't played a soul on offense. I mean, you look.
I will not stand for Graham Mertz slander around these parts, Payne.
Well, I mean, you think about this, right? Utah's played offenses with an average efficiency rank of 59th heading into this game. But you think about the 5 Power 5 offenses that Utah's faced. None of them had a stable quarterback situation in any of those spots. Florida, with Graham Mertz, making his first start for the Gators in a completely different offensive scheme. Faced Baylor's backup quarterback. Got a true freshman, Dante Moore, making his first real road start against a Power 5 defense. Heading into the weeknight game against Oregon State, there's lots of rumblings around DJU actually keeping his job after the rough game against Wazoo. Cal started a freshman QB, Fernando Mendoza, just his second start ever, first on the road. He ended up leaving the game with an injury. So, I mean, Utah's secondary has not been tested a lick, and somehow they're still outside the top 100 in explosive pass defense. So I think this is going to be really interesting. I'm going to be watching pretty closely to see how much noise is in Utah's defensive numbers facing a stable quarterback situation for the first time this season away from Rice-Eccles Stadium, which is a huge home field advantage. It's very clear here that sharp bettors wanted to buy USC at a depressed price. We've gone from as low as 4. We're out to the key of 7 here, but I just think it's the entire mindset of Lincoln Riley calling out his guys a little bit this week.
Yep.
Probably see a little bit of a refocused effort with Utah. Utah's defense probably a little bit overrated. And then on the other side of the ball, USC's defense, which isn't very good, is at least fighting an opponent with an offense kind of in its own weight class. And I think that's how we kind of had that large early week movement.
I think when you look at Utah, that weeknight game that you bring up is probably the most relevant data point for Oregon State. Now, I know Utah started the game with Nate Johnson, couldn't move the football whatsoever when you look at their sluggish start to the game, but Oregon State provided a little bit of balance. They had a tremendous opening drive script, and it allowed them to play with a lead. I think USC's first couple of drives are going to be more important in this game than maybe any they've played all season, because if you can force Utah to play down 10 to 14 points, they just don't have the horses in play to be able to get there. We look at the Utes and what they've done on the road against their 2 Power 5 opponents so far this season in the first half. It hasn't exactly been pretty by any stretch of the imagination. Mustered a grand total of 3 points. Were shut out in the first half by Oregon State, had just 3 against Baylor. We'll see if they're able to do a little bit more against the Trojans this weekend, because if USC bounces back, we know this offense is more than capable of scoring points and doing so in a hurry. But it wouldn't be a Bet the Board college football podcast, guys, if we didn't dive into the SEC for at least one marquee matchup. And, you know, depending on who you look at, this may be one of the better games that we'll see in the conference to try and define who these teams are, because there are some unique factors in play. That, of course, is Tennessee traveling down to Tuscaloosa to take on the Alabama Crimson Tide, and this number has moved all over, albeit through a lot of dead numbers, as low as 7.5 out there in the market, upwards of 9 with Alabama installed as a favorite. The total from a low of 48.5 at some shops, 49 also out there aplenty. Last year, number 6 Tennessee defeated Alabama 52-49, snapping a 15-game series-long losing streak. Did so as more than a touchdown underdog. Tennessee has lost 27 straight road games at AP top 15 teams. The last win in such a circumstance came back in 2006 when they knocked off the number 10 Georgia team. This will be only the second true road game for the Vols, and if the first one was any indication, it could be a long afternoon for Tennessee, because the Gators ran over, around, and through them in the first half, with Florida winning outright as a 4.5-point home underdog. Meanwhile, Alabama, they've now won 15 straight home games versus SEC opponents, 33-1 in their past 34. I know that obviously doesn't equate to covering numbers, but it is worth sharing that Alabama typically does what Alabama does at home. And you look at the Crimson Tide, they've been a very good bet on team, especially as more than a touchdown favorite in these kind of spots. So, Payne, we've been the ringleaders when it comes to the Joe Milton slander, but I don't think it's slander anymore. You are what the numbers say you are, and Joe Milton has struggled immensely to lead this Tennessee offense so far this year. Completed 112, 182 passing attempts this season. He's thrown for just 1,200 yards, 12th in the SEC, a season after Hendon Hooker threw for north of 3,000 yards, which is good enough for 4th in the league. But they've been able to lean on their ground game in Jalen Wright and Jabari Small. The offensive line has showed marked improvement with Cooper Mays back in the fold, but going down to Bryant-Denny Stadium against an Alabama defensive front that's getting after quarterbacks, this will prove to be Tennessee's greatest test to try, an obstacle to navigate over, around, and through.
Yeah, this to me is matchup versus price. And so it doesn't shock me that the spots that opened 10 got completely wiped out. It doesn't shock me that the places you could buy to the key affordably got wiped out, and now you're sitting kind of in that 7.5, 8, 8.5 range. In saying that, right, like our core number was 7. But I just don't see a path for points with this version of Tennessee's offense. Last week, the path was obvious, right? And Tennessee's offense with 2 weeks to prepare against an A&M defense that has serious issues in the secondary, to me, produced another disappointing effort. I mean, Joe Milton was 3 for 10 on throws, 10-plus yards, with 2 turnover-worthy passes against that A&M secondary, which, again, is outside the top 100 in EPA per pass. If you look at Milton's depth-adjusted accuracy this season, it's 40%. So there isn't consistency with Milton throwing, and his receivers haven't been a factor. 0% explosive pass rate last week. Okay. So, maybe the down-to-down throw game is working. Nope. 38% passing success rate. And it now looks like Bama will have Malachi Moore returning to their secondary. So it gets even tougher. Fortunately, the Vols offense was able to kind of grind out the game on the ground because its defense allowed them to. And maybe that's the path again here. We saw once, Walter Nolan left with an injury for A&M up front, and the Vols averaged nearly 3 yards per rush before first contact. That allowed them to stay in manageable situations and on standard downs. Tennessee had nearly a 75% rushing success rate on those runs. And still, like, when you're able to run that well, Milton in the throw game still can't do anything. It's just wild to me. But I don't know if you can run on Bama, right? And if you can't, then what? And right now, Bama top 20 in rushing success rate allowed. They're trending better up front. But last week, to me, was that data point where you had to show me for Tennessee's offense. You knew the areas you had to attack A&M. You had 2 weeks to prepare. A&M came off a war where you would have thought all of the tempo that Tennessee employs would have provided a little bit of an edge. It just never materialized on offense. I don't see Tennessee's offense doing a ton here relative to expectation. They're in the second hostile environment of the entire season. The first one was in the swamp. You referenced that, Todd. It did not go well offensively. So to me, if the Vols are going to stay within this number, it's about uglying it up. It's about getting the ground game going, and it's likely because their defense keeps them in this game.
Well, I think the same can be said for the other side with you look at both of these teams stronger defensively than what we've seen on the offensive side. And Brad, Alabama's offense not exactly going out there and lighting the world on fire by any stretch of the imagination. They've scored exactly 24 points in each of their last 3 home games. They had scored 24 points or fewer just 3 times in their previous 35 home games before this recent run. Jalen Milroe doing what's being asked of him. He's completed more than 17 passes just once over the last 5 games, but did take advantage of a questionable Aggie secondary with some deep balls a few weeks ago. Nick Saban didn't mince words, pretty much calling out his entire team for taking their foot off the gas and allowing an inferior Arkansas team to get back in the game last Saturday. But you look at Alabama and the root cause of a lot of their issues all along the offensive line. I mean, it's sack after sack after sack. And while the offensive line doesn't bear the full weight of responsibility there, some of it falls on Milroe for holding onto the football too long. In steps a Tennessee defense that, for me, has been a pleasant revelation because all the questions we have about Joe Milton and the lackluster passing offense, Tennessee's been able to lean on their defense that's been extremely disruptive, going out there and doing some of the things they weren't asked to do last year with Hendon Hooker and company operating in full capacity. So when you break down this side of the ball, do you see a decided edge that one of these teams can exploit?
Yeah, I think it's clear with the edge, at least in the pass rush versus the pass pro, is a big monster edge to Tennessee here. I mean, whenever you're setting records for the wrong reasons for Alabama, there's a major concern here. What's the record? Well, Milroe's been sacked at least 4 times in 5 consecutive games. That's ties for the longest streak for an FBS quarterback in the last 20 seasons. Unacceptable, considering the amount of talent that Alabama brings in each and every year as far as the recruiting. I mean, basic numbers here for Alabama's offense, mediocre at best, and that's nationally, not even compared to Alabama's previous successes on offense. I mean, number 58 in yards per play, 87 in yards per game, 58 in points per game. My goodness. But with all that being said, and the questions about can they protect Milroe, I think the game plan should be very simple for Alabama. We'll see if Tommy can put this one together here. But to me, let's not overcomplicate things. Let's give, like Payne has mentioned several times, anytime we're talking Alabama, let's just give him a couple reads. And whether, let's just keep him on reads there. Check 1. If it's not there, let's go to 2, and that's it. He should not be relying on Jalen Milroe to go to 3-4 reads here. And obviously, you're going to take your shots here, and which Milroe's been good at. Number 3 in the country in yards per attempt. But to me, it's just the inconsistency. I mean, did not start the game off well. It's 6-0. Arkansas's playing well. And then he does hit the big shot to Prentice. Totally changed the game out. And then you look like Alabama's going to run away with Arkansas. They score 24 straight. And then there's a stretch where Milroe's 1 for 9. Totally allows Arkansas to get back in the game. To me, I think Saban maybe hinted at it. I expect a very run-heavy game here for Alabama. Old school Alabama type of game, probably comparatively speaking, like the first 3-4 years in the Saban era here in Tuscaloosa. McClellan has been fine at running back. Saban said Justice Haynes, who gives him a little bit more explosiveness. He might get more touches, not only in this game, but down the stretch. So that's the expectation for me is let's not rely on Milroe in the throw game other than a couple of deep shots. Let's play calling wise, let's protect him and not call as many pass plays. It's tough to sack the quarterback when he's not back there 30 times trying to throw it. With that being said, Tennessee's defense, as much as Tennessee's offense is underwhelmed, big reason I haven't significantly downgraded Tennessee's power rating this year has been the improvements on the defensive side of the ball. I mentioned the pass rush led by James Pierce, highest graded defender in college football last week by PFF, 7 quarterback pressures. He's got a 26.8% pressure rate this year in college football. That's first. Tyler Barron has 5 sacks. Their defensive tackle, probably their best defensive tackle, got banged up. He should be ready to go, according to Heupel this week. Beasley at linebacker. The Haddon kid at cornerback, I question. He had a very questionable effort against Florida. He's rebounding in a big way. Big plays against South Carolina. Big plays last week. This is a Tennessee defense, number 4 success rate, number 10 in EPA per play. To me, they have the edge. But it all really depends Alabama game plan specific. I do still question if Alabama just wants to line up and run right at Tennessee here and use Milroe in the run game. I actually see a little bit of a pathway for success for Alabama.
I mean, Brad, to your point, that's kind of what Florida did. In the only game where we saw the Vols in a true road environment, Florida was able to hit the explosive. They just kind of ran between the tackles and wanted to try and see if Tennessee could match them from a physicality standpoint, something the Vols weren't able to do. Maybe that was a learning experience, or maybe that's a red flag for what we could see on full display in this particular game, knowing that Alabama probably doesn't fear Tennessee's offense nearly the same way they did last year when it was deep ball after deep ball after deep ball, Hendon Hooker connecting in man coverage over the top against that Alabama secondary. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media. Most importantly, for all things Bet the Board, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. All right, my good man, it is best bet portion of the program. But before we get to that, a little bit of breaking news for a game that we broke down earlier in the program. It appears the winds of change may be impacting the Florida State-Duke football game. What did you uncover, Payne?
Yeah, it sounds like Riley Leonard has returned to practice earlier this morning, and Mike Elko is saying there's a good chance he can play. Potentially some gamesmanship here. We'll see. I still have the thought in my head that, if he's only 70%, throwing him out there probably not the best idea. And as soon as Elko has the quote of "There's a good chance he'll play." The following sentence is, "We're not going to put him out there unless the ankle's 100%. So maybe some gamesmanship. We'll see. If Riley Leonard doesn't have the full repertoire, his legs are so important to him, And again, if you lose this one and it buys him another week of health, you go to Louisville, you still got the UNC game. There's still a path to making the ACC championship game. Even with a loss here, you throw him out there at 70%. He gets rolled up on, and he's now out, the next 3 weeks, your season's done. So I think that is ultimately the math or the calculus behind a potential decision there. But just wanted to update folks that there was a little bit more of a positive outlook on the potential of Riley Leonard playing this week.
And when some of that news broke, the number did come off of that 2-touchdown threshold. We're now looking at a lot of 13s and 13.5s, more or less the prevailing price tag. But the joys of doing podcasts instead of live radio. All right, though, best bet, look where we are going this weekend. I will allow you to continue to take us on this magical mystery tour.
It's not a mystery tour, but I like how you presented that. We talked about this game at the top. It's the biggest game of the weekend. This wasn't intentionally done, but we probably spent, 10, 15, 20 minutes breaking down Penn State, Ohio State. It's time-stamped above, so go there and listen to all our thoughts, Brad included. Now, I mentioned this total. It got whacked at open. It got dummied back up for a second whack. And now we're at 45.5 across the market. So we've seen the full game move. The first half has not been touched as much. And there's a bunch of 23.5 out there. Let's go with the first half under. Penn State, Ohio State, under 23.5. We'll call it minus 20. What I will say to you is, if you're going to listen to this Saturday morning, 23.5 is not going to be there. 23 flat, still a good number, right? That's a little bit of a key. Once you start getting below 23, it gets a little bit dicey. And then also like the comparison of 23.5 minus 35, right? You'd rather have 23 flat. So we'll call it 23 minus 20 because that's what's fair right now at the time of this release. Still good to 23, I believe. And then again, if you're shopping and you have a couple books, 23.5 minus 35 versus 23 flat, like go with the flat number there. But I think we see a little bit of a slower start. You look at Penn State's games on the road, slow starting at Northwestern, slow starting at Illinois. Ohio State, I think, feels like they want to try and run the ball. And so to me, now that you've had this depressed full game at 45.5, I don't really want to get to the point of the game where they comprehend, hey, we might not be able to run it, and we get chuck fests at that point. And so getting in and getting out makes a world of sense, especially if you can waste a possession or two in the first half as both try to figure out that they potentially can't run it. So first half under 23.5, we'll call it minus 20 as the official grade.
The proverbial touching of gloves early on in the game, nothing better than to put together an 8 to 10 play drive that covers 26 yards, takes you out to your own 47-yard line, and you punt and pin, and we play the rinse and repeat all the hits like Top 40 Radio to be able to get us to the break at 7-3 one way or another. All right, my friends, some marquee games this weekend.
7-3, huh?
Yeah, 7-3 works, right? By my monkey math.
I gotta tell you, I'll take 10-10.
Okay, 10-10 works.
That works.
Well, at 10-10, only if they kick a field goal as time expires. I don't want to have to go through a kick return at 10-10 at any point with, under 3 minutes to go.
Nothing in your life has been difficult. We'll give you a little sweat here, maybe.
I need a sweat like I need a kick in the nuts, my friend. Let's put it that way. Anything else you want to share with our loyal listenership before we reconvene 24 hours from now and talk about the NFL?
No, let's wrap this up so our producer can get it out as quickly as possible.
All right, you got it. For Brad Powers, Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your week, I think it's 8, college football investments, and with a Penn State, Ohio State first half under ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.